Wow, check out this guy. School of Great Men with an 8. Here's how you value yourself as a man. Invited late, decline. Not invited, don't go. Be forgotten, forget them. Used, set firm boundaries. Ignored, stop approaching. Betrayed, forgive and move on. Not appreciated, keep your distance. Insulted, outshine them with success. Disrespected, walk away with dignity. Underestimated, let your results speak. Now we're going to talk about whether you should bookmark this, keep it in the bank, or throw that shit in the garbage, flush it down the toilet. If you like these funny self-improvement myths or actual facts that you can keep in your head so you can improve, subscribe, hit the like button, and go watch the other videos I have. They're all a form of improving yourself, and you might have a laugh while you do it. I get why this hits with a lot of men, like immediately. You read it once and your brain's already nodding with it. It feels clean, direct, no fluff, just cause and effect. Do this, not that. Walk away, keep your dignity. Essentially, let results speak. And honestly, that alone is why it spreads around. A lot of men are exhausted from over-explaining themselves, over-giving, over-saying, and overthinking situations where the respect clearly isn't there. When you've been in that place, a list like this doesn't feel harsh. It feels relieving. Like someone finally said what you've been thinking, but didn't know how to organize all that shit that's in your brain. It's simple, clear, and feels empowering because it removes ambiguity. You don't have to guess what to do. You don't have to sit in indecision. The list tells you, if this happens, respond like this. That certainty is comforting, especially when you've been burned before. And most guys reading this have been at least half of the situation. Invited late, forgotten, used, ignored, underestimated, disrespected in subtle ways that are hard to call out without sounding insecure. So when you see these moments, it just so plainly validates your feelings. Like, yeah, that happened to me. I wasn't crazy for feeling similar to that. Fuck yeah. There's something powerful about seeing your experiences reflected back at you without judgment. That's why the self and respect message underneath this list is real. It's not imaginary. The core idea that you don't need to beg for attention, chase validation, or tolerate disrespect, it's a solid choice. A lot of men were never taught how to set boundaries in a healthy way. They were taught to either endure everything silently or explode when it becomes unbearable. This list offers a third option: withdraw calmly. And for men who've been too available, too forgiving, too eager to keep the peace, that feels like growth. But here's where it gets tricky. Lists like this work because they flat out tell you all the complex ideas that you want to hear. They turn emotional situations to rule, and rules feel safer than judgment. If you've been hurt before, having a rule book feels like protection. You don't have to feel your way through each interaction. You just apply the rule and move on. The trap is that real life doesn't always fit into clean categories. Not being invited doesn't always mean you were intentionally excluded. Being invited late isn't always a diss. Being forgotten doesn't always mean you were unvalued. Sometimes people are disorganized, overwhelmed, socially clumsy, or just operating in their own world. They're not thinking about you the way you think they're thinking. They're not saying, wow, George over there is a loser. Kimberly over there doesn't know what she's doing at all. And when you treat every misalignment as disrespect, your risk hardens in ways you don't even notice right away. Another subtle thing is how empowering language can quickly turn to armor. Walking away feels strong, and sometimes it is. But if walking away becomes the default response to discomfort, it can also become avoidance very quickly. That's not necessarily saying the list sucks. It's just another point of view. When men adapt rigid rules early, they don't always realize what they're trading away. Flexibility, context, the ability to read intent instead of reacting to impact alone, those are skills too. And they're way harder to develop than simply cutting people off. Let's also take a look at this emotional appeal here. A list like this doesn't just protect self-respect, it restores a sense of control. When you've felt ignored or undervalued, control is what you crave. Deciding to disengage gives you that back. It flips the power dynamic in your head, and that feels good. But power felt internally doesn't always equal power used wisely. That's why these lists are seductive. They work in the short term. They reduce pain quickly. They help you stop chasing, and for a lot of men, that's necessary depending on what stage in life you're. The issue isn't the message, it's the idea that this is the final form of self-respect, because the strongest men aren't just the ones who know when to walk away. They're also the ones who know when something is worth addressing, clarifying, or letting go without turning into a rude fucking dick. If you read the list and feel relief, that tells you something important about where you are. It means you've probably been tolerating more than you should have. It means boundaries are overdue. That doesn't mean every line should be followed blindly. So yeah, I understand why this resonates. It speaks to real experience, real frustrations, real moments of being overlooked or minimized. Just remember, anything that feels this empowering this fast deserves a second look. Not to reject it, but to use it with intention instead of letting it use you. Because self-respect isn't just how quickly you walk away, it's about how clearly you choose it. So let's get into the part where what this gets right. There are parts of this list that are genuinely right, and pretending otherwise would just be dishonest. You don't need to agree with every line to recognize that's touching on something a lot of men struggle with, but rarely articulate. Boundaries matter more than most men realize. Not in the Instagram Instagram quote sense. In the day-to-day, awkward, uncomfortable moments where you decide what you tolerate and what you don't. A lot of men were raised to be accommodated, patient, and low maintenance, especially socially and emotionally. Over time, that can quickly turn into overextension. You say yes when you should pause. You stay when you should reassess. You absorb disrespect because calling it out feels risky. This list pushes back against that. It reminds men that they're allowed to draw lines without explaining themselves to death. And for many, that alone is a shift that they've never been encouraged to make. Walking away can be healthier than chasing respect. And this is one most men only learn the hard way. There's a point where trying to be understood turns into trying to be accepted. You explain yourself again, you adjust your behavior, you lower your standards a little bit more, and somehow the respect never arrives. Knowing when to disengage is a skill. It protects your time, your emotional bandwidth, and your self-image. Walking away isn't always about punishment or pride. Sometimes it's just recognizing that a situation isn't responsive to effort. Continue to push doesn't make you noble. It just makes you tired. Another thing the list gets right is that not every situation deserves your energy. Energy is finite, and most men spend years treating it like it's unlimited. They respond to every diss. They argue every misunderstanding. They replay every insult in their head long after it happened. But maturity often looks like selective engagement, choosing what to invest, choosing what actually matters, letting some things pass, not because you're weak, but because you're focused. That kind of restraint doesn't look dramatic, but it's powerful. And this list, at its best, encourages that. There's also a solid point in this idea that self-worth shouldn't be negotiated repeatedly. If you find yourself constantly trying to prove your value to the same people, that's information you can keep gaining in order to make a very thought out answer to your problem, and things won't be so harsh. You won't feel like you messed up in any way. Healthy respect tends to be consistent. You don't have to chase it. You don't have to remind people who you are every week. If you do, something's off, either in the dynamic or in the expectation. This list reminds men that their worth isn't something they need to overthink and fight against every time someone forgets, overlooks, or underestimates them. And finally, the idea that results speak louder than arguments is one of the most grounded points here. Arguing for your value rarely works. Convincing people rarely sticks. What does stick is behavior over time, follow through, growth, and quiet competence. You don't tell anyone about it. Men who stop explaining and start focusing tend to feel better. Even if no one else notices right away, there's a stability that comes from knowing you're improving regardless of who's watching. That's not about revenge or proving people wrong. It's about alignment, putting your energy into things that compound instead of conversations that drain you. So yeah, this list isn't showing you how big his dick is. It touches on real principles, boundaries, discernments, self-respect, and focus. Those are things most men don't get enough guidance on. The danger isn't in these ideas themselves. It's in treating them as absolutes instead of tools. If you use these rules right, they help men not have big egos and start respecting themselves. Used wrongly, they can turn into isolation, resentment, or emotional shutdown. But at its core, this list is reacting to a real problem. Too many men give more than they should to people who haven't earned it. And the moment you can call that out to yourself is a step forward, even if the next step requires more nuance, or it might take a little bit of time to research. Now let's flip the idea and give you a different perspective. One thing that's easy to miss in conversations about self-respect is that it's not only defined by who you walk away from, it's also shaped by who you stay grounded around. The people you can relax with, the ones you don't feel the need to perform for, the environments where you're steady instead of guarded. If self-respect only shows up when you're cutting people off, it becomes reactive. Real respect is not as loud as all the other shit you do. It's present even when nothing dramatic is happening. It shows up in how you choose your circles, how you communicate, and how little you feel the need to prove everything. That's an important distinction because not every moment of discomfort is a signal to leave. Sometimes being invited late isn't disrespect. It's just logical. People are busy. They're disorganized. They assume you're flexible. They don't always realize how things land. Interpreting every misstep as a diss can harden you in ways you don't notice until you're isolated alone. Maturity is being able to tell the difference between intentional disrespect and someone just straight up disrespecting you. One deserves distance. The other might just deserve a conversation or even nothing at all. The same goes for being ignored. Being overlooked once doesn't define your value. It doesn't rewrite your place in a group or erase your worth. Sometimes it's timing. Sometimes it's distraction. Sometimes it has nothing to do with you. When every moment of silence is treated like rejection, your nervous system never rests. You're constantly scanning for meaning that may not be there. That kind of hypervigilance feels like strength, but it's exhausting. Self-respect can look like not taking every moment personally. Another thing happens when you stop trying to outperform people and start outgrowing them. Outperforming keeps you tied to comparison. You're still measuring yourself against the same reference points, just trying to win instead of lose. Outgrowing is quieter. It's when your priorities change, when certain dynamics no longer fit, when you don't need to prove anything better because the comparison itself no longer matters. Outgrowing doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need validation. It just happens over time as you value sharpen. That's a big difference from trying trying to outshine people. Outshining keeps them in your mental frame. Outgrowing people lets them fade naturally. And then there's calm consistency, one of the most underrated forms of respect. People often think respect comes from dramatic gestures, walking away, making statements, drawing hard lines. Sometimes it does, but long-term respect is usually earned through predictability, showing up the same way, doing what you say, not reacting emotionally to every bump in the road, letting your behavior speak without needing commentary. Calm consistency builds trust. Resentment destroys that. When you hold things in and hope people notice your absence or effort, you're still outsourcing your self-worth. You're waiting to be seen. Calm consistency doesn't wait. It just moves forward. This doesn't mean tolerating disrespect or staying where you're diminished. It means choosing responses that are aligned with who you want to be, not just what feels satisfying in the moment. There's a difference between dignity and distance. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they don't. A more mature lens recognizes that self-respect isn't about hard rules applied universally. It's about judgment, context, emotional regulation, the ability to pause before deciding whether something is worth your energy. When you develop that, you don't need lists to tell you when to leave. You can feel it, and you don't need to overreact to things that don't matter. You become harder to shake, not harder to reach. And that's usually the version of self-respect that lasts. The one that doesn't need to announce itself, prove itself, or protect itself consistently. It just does what it does. Let me go into it even further for the people in the back. A lot of men end up clinging to rules like this not because they're arrogant, but because they're tired of feeling overlooked, tired of second guessing themselves, tired of walking away from situations wondering if they should have handled things differently. When confidence takes enough small hits over time, it starts to bruise. And when it's bruised, structure feels like relief. Rules give clarity when self-trust feels unstable. They remove the need to feel your way through moments that already hurt. Instead of asking, what's actually happening here? You just follow the script. It feels decisive, clean, protective. That's why rigid rules feel safe when your self-image is shaky. That limits uncertainty. And uncertainty is what insecure confidence can't tolerate. If you've ever felt unsure of where you stand with people, having a rule book feels like armor. You don't have to risk being misunderstood again. You don't have to expose yourself emotionally. You just disengage. The problem is safety and strength aren't the same thing. Confidence isn't built by cutting everyone off. Isolation might reduce friction, but it also removes feedback. And feedback, even uncomfortable feedback, is how you refine your sense of self. When you avoid people entirely, you also avoid the chance to practice self-trust in real time. A man who truly is confident doesn't need distance from everyone. He needs discernment, and that's harder. Choosing responses instead of reacting to one is one of the most underrated skills men can develop. Reaction feels powerful because it's immediate. It creates a sense of control. Someone disrespects you, you withdraw. Someone ignores you, you disappear. Someone underestimates you, you slightly vow revenge through success. But reactions are driven by the moment. Responses are driven by value. Responses are driven by value. A response gives you space to decide whether something actually matters. Space actually gives you time to think about the answer and how to react instead of giving an emotional one. Space to remain grounded instead of guarded. That space is where real confidence lives. Most men were never taught how to sit in that space. They were taught to either swallow discomfort or act on it. Very few were taught how to process it without letting it define them. That's why being unaffected is more powerful than being unavailable. Being unavailable still gives spotlight to the other person. You're leaving because of them. You're reacting to them. Being unaffected means your eternal state isn't dictated by their behavior at all. That's a higher level of self-respect. You don't need to disappear to feel strong. You don't need to make a statement to preserve your dignity. Sometimes strength is staying steady while someone else is chaotic. Sometimes it's letting something pass without assignments meaning to it. Sometimes it's letting something pass without needing to react to it and leaving it alone. This is especially relevant for men because many of us tie our worth to how we're perceived. Respect feels external, earned conditionally, so when it's threatened, we scramble to restore it. Rules offer an illusion of control in that scramble, but long-term confidence comes from internal alignment, not external compliance. It comes from knowing who you are, what you tolerate, and why, not just what the value says to do. That's why men who rely heavily on rigid frameworks often feel powerful at first and very, very empty later. The rules work until they don't, until life presents a situation the list doesn't cover, until walking away costs something more important, until cutting people off becomes loneliness. The goal isn't to obtain boundaries. It's the need to outgrow the need for the crazy one. As your self-trust strengthens, you don't need hard rules to protect it. You can feel when something's off. You can respond calmly. You can assert yourself without burning bridges or building walls. That's when confidence stops being something you can defend and starts being something you embody. And that's a shift most men don't realize is possible because they've never been shown a version of strength that isn't reactive. This conversation isn't really about a list. It's about how men learn to protect themselves when they've been hurt and whether those protections eventually turn into limitations. The strongest men aren't the ones who walk away the fastest. They're the ones who don't need to. This is honestly why I ended up talking so much about self-respect without about becoming closed off because there's a difference between protecting yourself and shrinking your world. And a lot of men slide from one into the other without realizing it, especially when they've been burnt a few times. If you don't know how to change the person that you are and you need a little bit of help, answer the Google Doc up above or below, wherever it is.